Okay, now we're going to present the exercises for lab 7, which is iterations using for loop for the purpose of accumulating numbers. So we're going to use for loop to accumulate numbers in particular in this lab here. So we start with a simple sample code. You are given a list of scores for quizzes. So here's an example. So we have quiz is equals to a list of numbers here. So each of these numbers represents a score for one quiz, and we start counting from 0. So quiz 0 has score 5, quiz 1 has score 3, and so on. You have seen these examples many times. Now we are asked to find the total score of all quizzes using for loop. Okay, so we have discussed this solution before. Without using for loop, you can use the built-in function sum to find out the total sum of the numbers in the list quiz, which is 35. Okay, so this built-in function is given to you in Python, so you can just use it. However, as a practice, I would like you to write a for loop to sum up the elements of quizzes, okay, and compare your solution to the solutions given by the built-in functions to check whether the solution is right, for example. So we have a for loop. We're going to iterate through every element in quiz. So for x in quiz, right? So we're going to iterate all the elements in quiz. For x in quiz, what we're going to do is that we take these elements and add it to our result. So we first initialize our result equals to 0. Okay, so at the beginning, the result is 0. And then every time we go through this quiz, all right, we take the next elements of the quiz and add it to result. So it will be result is equals to result plus x. That is, we add x to result, okay? And the value of result plus s will be computed and stored in the variable result again, okay? So alternatively, you can write a shortcut with result plus equals to x. So this is equivalent to result equals to result plus x. Okay, and at the end, after the for loop, outside the for loop, you're gonna print result. All right, we get 35, which is the same as the value that you get if you use the built-in function. All right, so at the beginning, result is equal to 0. And for x in quiz, so first iteration, x takes the value of 5 and then add 5 to result. So result is equal to 0. After you add 5, the result will be 5. Right? 0 plus 5 is 5. And then you go back to line 2, execute the next value of x of quiz, which is 3. So x now takes the value of 3, and then you add this value of x, which is 3, to the current value of result, which we have updated to 5 earlier on. So it becomes 5 plus 3, which is 8. Okay, and so on and so forth. And ultimately, we'll have 4 added to the value of results, and we end up with 35. Okay, so this solution here, we have discussed it we discuss it in detail in the lecture. Right? So now it's your turn. As an exercise, you are given a list of transactions made from a bank account for a month, for 30 days. Okay, so transactions is a list of numbers. All right, it contains 30 numbers. Okay, for each transactions is for each day. All right, we count from 0, so we start with day 0. And a positive amount represents deposit to the account, so we add money to the account. A negative amount represents withdrawal from the account. Okay, so if you have a negative, for example, negative 50 means you withdraw $50 from the account. All right, so at day 0, you add $100, you deposit $100 into the account. At day 1, it's minus 50, means that you withdraw $50 from the account. At day 2, okay, we start counting from 0. So this is day 1, day 0, day 1, day 2. At day 2, you deposit $150. At day 3, you deposit $200. At day 4, you withdraw $30. You withdraw $30. Okay. So now you are asked to write a program to compute the total balance in the account after 30 days using for loop. So in other words, you want to find the sum of all the numbers in transactions. Okay. Find the sum of all numbers in the list transactions. Okay. That will give you the total balance in the account after 30 days. Okay. So first day you have $100, you deposit $100. All right. And then the subsequent day you withdraw $50. So the balance after day 1, it will be $50. And then on day 2, you add $150. So 50 plus 150 will be $200. And then so on and so forth. So after 30 days, what will be your balance? That will be the sum of all these elements in the list transactions, right? So first execute this code here so that you have variable defined. Okay, variable transactions is defined now to be this list of 30 numbers. Some of them are positive, some of them are negative. Now again, for you to check whether your solution is right, you can use the built-in function, transactions. This is using built-in function to sum all the values, all the numbers in transactions with 1055. Now, this is not what the question asks for. The output is what the question asks for, but the question asks you to do this using for loop. So we can use a for loop to sum up all the elements in these transactions, and hopefully the answer will be equals to 1055. This will indicate that your solutions using for loop is right. Okay, so we're gonna run a similar code here. So we start with result equals to 0. Okay, and for x in what? We're gonna iterate through what? Earlier on, we iterate through our list. All right, we're gonna sum up all elements in quiz. So we're gonna iterate x in quiz. Now we're gonna sum up elements in transactions. So you should put for x in transactions. Okay, and for each iteration, what are you gonna do? Okay, so what are you gonna do? So you're gonna write it down here. For each iteration, what are you gonna do? So you basically gonna add x to result, which is x plus equals to result. And at the end, you're gonna print the result. This print result is after, which is outside the for loop. Okay, so after you complete it, run the code and check whether the output is the same as 1055. If it is, then you know your solution is right. Now let's go to this next example. So again, we use the same example of quiz with a little modification. So now the quiz score can take a negative value. Okay, a score is -1 if the student missed the quiz. All right, so we have quiz 0, the student got 5 points. Quiz 1, the student got 3 points. And in quiz 2, he got score of -1 because the student missed quiz 2. All right. And we are asked to find the total score of all quizzes for which the student attended using for loop. So basically, we want to add those scores that are positive. All right. Because those scores that are negative are those for which the student did not attend. And you are asked to find the total score of all the quizzes for which the student attended. So we are not interested to find the score we are not interested in those quizzes for which the student did not attend. We're only interested in those quizzes for which the student has attended. Okay, so you are basically, in other words, you are asked to find the sum of all positive scores or in quiz. Those that are negative, we don't take them. Okay, how about 0? So 0 plus anything is 0. So you basically don't need to be, you don't need to add 0 into your result because 0 plus anything didn't add anything to it. Okay? Okay. So you only sum up all the positive score in quiz. So gonna do the same as before with a certain modification. Okay, let's see. So we have result equals to 0 for every element in quiz, for x in quiz. All right. Initially, before that, we're gonna add everything, result plus equals to x. But right now, we are only interested to add those that are positive. So we're gonna have an if statement. If x is greater than 0, if x is positive, then we will add x to result. Okay. If not, we don't add it to result. We don't do anything. Okay. We continue with the next iteration. All right. So here we have 35 as a solution. Okay. So you only add up all this positive score. For 5, 3 is positive. These are positive. So 8 plus 4, 12, 17, 19, 24, 27, what's this, 4? Okay, so it's 30, 34, 35, all right? But here, we can't use the built-in function to help us to do sanity check. So sum will sum up all the elements, but we're only interested in those that are positive. So in that case, we can't do anything. Actually, I make a mistake here. I forgot to initialize this. So quiz value has changed. So earlier on, this is my quiz value. Okay. And it has changed from here to here. And so I will have to change in this part here. Okay. Make these changes. So here I have a new quiz value. And so I need to execute this once so that the quiz variable has changed to this. So I'm going to run it again and I get 31. Okay, let's do a sanity check. So 5 plus 3 is 8, 12, 17, 19, 24, 27, 31. Okay, so now with this new value of quiz, we get the final value, which is 31, which is what we want. Okay. All right, now it's your turn to do this exercise. You are given a list of transactions just like before. There are positive values, there are negative values. And write a program to compute the total amount of deposits made in 30 days. So we're only interested in the amount of deposit. We are not interested in withdrawal. So the same thing. So in other words, we want to compute the total sum of positive number in the list transactions. Okay. Again, we don't have to care about 0 because 0 plus something doesn't add anything, doesn't change the result. Okay. So we only care about the sum of all the positive number in transactions. So here, the same thing. We have result equals to 0. You start with 0. And then you're going to run your for loop for x in transactions. Okay. And you're going to run the if statement. Okay. If x is positive, if it's greater than 0, then you add it into result. Okay. And at the end, which is outside the for loop, you're going to print result. Okay. Now remember, for these cases where we require if statement, we can't use sum directly, the built-in function. We can't use that. So you need to learn how to use for loop to execute this task here. Now let's look at the next example. So you are given a list of scores for quizzes, all right? And you are asked to find the total score of all quizzes the student attended and the total score of missed quizzes. Okay, you're asked to find two numbers. One is the total score of all quizzes the student have attended. So this part is the same as example code 1. The total score of all quizzes for which the student attended. With the additional requirement that you also need to compute the total score of missed quizzes. So each missed quiz has a score of -1. So the total score of missed quiz is negative. All right. So in this case, it missed 1 quiz, 2 quiz. So in the total score of missed quiz is -2. All right. So we have two things that we want to compute. So because you have to know how to do this, all right? Where the first one, so basically we want to compute two values. One, which is the sum of positive values. Two, it will be the sum of negative values in the list, okay? So the sum of positive values, you already know how to do that from the earlier examples. And then you can consider to write another for loop. Okay, so result for second result. So result for positive value. Okay, and then you have result for negative value, which is also start from 0. You run a for loop, and if x is now less than 0, then you add it to result negative. And then you print result negative. Okay, so let's run this. Okay, so you have the sum of the positive value is 31. The sum of the negative value is -2. All right, so it do the same thing. You iterate over the quiz. If it's positive, you add it to result pos. Result underscore pos will be the sum of all the positive values in the list. And then you declare another variable called result underscore negative, which represents the result of the sum of all the negative values in the list. Okay, so again, you initialize it to 0. You run through every element in the quiz. If the element is negative, you add it to result negative, and then you print the result negative. Okay, so you computed your two values, which is the sum of the positive values, sum of the negative values. Okay, so you can, for example, print a more meaningful statement, say print the total score of quizzes the student attended is, in this case, it will be our result underscore pos. And then you also have print the total score of missed quizzes is, in this case, it will be result negative. Okay. So we have 31 and -2 as our solutions. But notice here, we have two iterations. One, to find the sum of all the positive numbers. And the second iteration, where a second for loop, we have two for loops here. The first for loop, where we find the sum of all the positive numbers, and the second for loop where we find the sum of all the negative numbers. So we have two for loops. In each of the for loop, we're going to go through the elements in the quiz and examine each element in the quiz. So in total, you examined each element in quiz twice, once in the first for loop and once in the second for loop. So every element you check twice to see whether it's positive. If it's positive, you add it to result pause in the first for loop, and in the second for loop to check whether it's negative. If it's negative, you add it into result negative in the second for loop. Now, if you want to be more efficient, you shouldn't create two for loops. Rather, you should go through the list once only, because when you take out the elements of the list of the quiz to examine whether it's positive, if it's not positive, you already know that it's negative. All right, so you don't have to go through the list again and check the exact same element whether it's negative in the second for loop. So it becomes redundant to do that test. So instead, we're going to improve our solutions, improve the code to use only one for loop. All right, and hence you only examined each element in the list once. Okay, so a remark. So this solution uses two for loops. Okay, and so each element in the list is examined twice. Okay, one to check if it is positive, and once to check if it's negative. This is unnecessary because once you check if it is not positive, it has to be negative. You don't have to check that anymore. All right. So instead, we're gonna improve the following code. Okay. So in the following, we're gonna improve the code. Okay. We're gonna improve the code to use only one for loop, and hence you only examine each element in the list once only. All right. So here's what we're gonna do: is that we initialize result positive equals to 0, result negative equals to 0 as well. All right. And then we run for loop once through the list for x in quiz. Okay. For every element in quiz, we examine it once. We check whether if it's greater 0. Okay. If it's greater 0, then we add it into result positive. Result underscore pause plus equals to x. Else, if it's not positive, then it is either 0 or negative. Okay. So result negative. So if it's greater equals to 0, we add it into result positive or non-negative. So it doesn't matter because when it's equals to 0, you add 0 into result positive is still the right answer, because 0 add into anything is the answer still remain the same. So if it's else, that means it's negative. You add it into result negative. Okay. And at the end, you will have your print statement. All right. Let's run this and we get the same answer as before. 31 here, and -2, we have -2 here. Okay. So notice that we have the same answer, but every element in the quiz is only examined once. Once you check whether it's greater equals to 0, if it's greater equals to 0, you add it into result pause. If it's not, if this return false, that means it has to be negative. You don't have to check whether it's negative like in here. You already know that it's negative by checking whether this is true or not, all right? If it's not true, then you add x into result negative. Now here's your turn to do the exercise. You write a program to compute the total amount of deposit made in 30 days and total amount of withdrawal made in 30 days. So again, yeah, in other words, you need to compute two values. One, which is the sum of all positive or non-negative numbers in the list, and two, the sum of all negative numbers in the list. All right, so the same thing, you can run two for loop, but that is not this is really completely unnecessary. Instead, you should write just one for loop, all right, over every element in the quiz. Examine each element once to check whether it's positive or negative. All right, so this is for you to do. And of course, at the end, you need to print the statement, right? So total amount of withdrawal is total amount of deposit is something. The total amount of withdrawal is something. Right, so we have result cost equals to 0 at the beginning, result negative is equals to 0 at the beginning, and the rest to do. Run a for loop over all elements in transactions and complete the task. Okay. Now let's look at here where you are asked to count. Instead of summing elements in the list, we are asking to count now. Basically, we asked to find the total number of quizzes the student attended. So we are not interested in the score or interested in the number of quizzes that the student has attended. So we count. So in other words, you are asked to compute or to count the number of non-negative values in quiz. Okay? So if the student gets 0, it means that he attended the quiz, but he didn't get any score. Okay, means he didn't get any answers correctly, but he did attend the score. He did attend the quiz, but he gets score 0. Okay, so you need to take into account of 0 as he has attended as well. So you need to count all the numbers, not just positive, but those they are non-negative. So non-negative values are those that are 0 or that are at least 0. Okay, so those that are at least zeros, those are non-negative numbers. All right, not just positive numbers. 0 is also counted as one quiz that the student has attended. Okay, so here, so we have a counter that we start equals to 0. Okay, so initially counter is equal to 0. We're gonna run through the list for x in quiz. All right, the list name is quiz. For x in quiz, if x is greater or equal to 0, that means it's non-negative. If it's at least 0, it is non-negative. Then we add 1 to counter. Okay, we add 1 to counter. So every time, so you go through every element in quiz. All right, and then you check whether this is greater or equal to 0. If this is greater or equal to 0, means that student attended this quiz. So you're gonna add 1 to the counter. Okay, and then you go to the next element. 3 is greater or equal to 0. Okay, the student attended this quiz. I'm gonna add 1 into my counter again. So every time you encounter a non-negative value, you add 1 into your counter because you want to count, right? But if we see a negative number, we know that it doesn't satisfy that it's greater or equal to 0, then you ignore it. You don't add 1 into counter. You ignore it. You continue with the next element, which is 4. And 4 is greater or equal to 0. So we count these. We add 1 into our counter. And at the end, outside the for loop, we're going to print counter. So here the value is 9, which means that the student attended 9 quizzes. All right. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. So in total, it attended 9 quizzes. Okay. Now we go to sample code. We can extend this. Suppose you are not just asked to find the total number of quizzes a student attended, you are asked to find the average quiz score for all quizzes that the student attended. So we don't count those that the students, we don't count the scores of those for which the student did not attend, but we want to examine the average total scores of those quizzes that the student have attended. Okay, so recall that the average is sum is total divided by number of elements. Okay, but in this case, remember that we're average over all the quizzes that the student attended. All right, so we compute the total of score of all quizzes that the student attended, all right, divided by the number of quizzes that the student attended. All right, we need to compute the total score of all quizzes that the student attended, and then divided by the number of quizzes that the student attended. All right, so in other words, we compute the sum of all non-negative scores in quiz. All right, if the score is non-negative, means he has attended the quiz, divided by the number of non-negative values, non-negative scores in quiz. So we need 2 numbers, sum of all the non-negative score in quiz, and then we need the second number, which is the number of non-negative score in quiz. All right, and we take the first number divided by the second number. So the first number, you already know how to do it, which is here in sample code 1. All right, the total score of all quizzes for which the student attended, and the number of scores, the number of quiz for which a student has attended. You just have seen it in sample code 3A, the total number of quizzes a student have attended. So you have these 2 values at hand, okay? So first you have counter equal to 0. So this will be computing the number of quizzes the student have attended. And from sample code 1, you have the total scores of all the quizzes the student have attended. These 2 values. So the average equals to result divided by counter. And we can print average. Okay. So in total, the total score of which the quizzes for which the student, the total score of quizzes for which the student has attended is 31, and there are 9 of them. So on average, the student scores is 3.444 and so on. Okay, again, this is using 2 for loop. All right, this is using 2 for loop here. And notice that we always ask, is it necessary to have 2 for loops? Is it necessary to examine each element in quiz twice? If you have 2 for loop, which means you examine each element here in the quiz twice. So again, it's unnecessary. Okay, so I'm gonna write here, remark. Using 2 for loops are unnecessary. Okay, can simplify the code, or we can optimize the code using just 1 for loop to examine each value in the list once. Okay, so how? Notice that here, we can actually easily change this to x greater than equals to 0. It doesn't really matter. If x equals to 0, you are adding 0 to result, which doesn't change anything. Okay, so you basically will have the same value. All right, so we have for x in quiz, if x greater equals 0, result plus equals to x. For x in quiz, if x greater 0, counter plus equals to 1. Okay, so as you can see here, they are actually the same. So we just have to move counter plus equals to 1 into here, then we can just run 1 for loop. Okay, so we can do here. So we start with result equals to 0. And then we have counter equals to 0 for every x increase. All right, if x is greater equals to 0, all right, we have add x into result, and then we add 1 to counter. Okay, now the same as before, the average is equals to result divided by counter, and then you can print the average, which is 3.444. Okay, you can write more meaningful messages, say the average score of all quizzes that the student attended is this, which is 3.444. So notice we just examined each element in the quiz 1. If it's positive, if it's greater or equal to 0, actually, then you add the value to result. This result will be the sum of the total scores of non-negative values in the list, and you also add 1 to the counter. All right, because we want to count how many elements in this quiz here that is non-negative. All right, and we're gonna take result divided by counter, that will be our average. Now here's the same. You're gonna do that for this exercise here using the example transactions. So you write a program to compute the number of days a deposit is made in 30 days. So in other words, compute the number of, count the number of elements in transactions that are non-negative. Non-negative means greater or equals to 0. At least greater or equal to 0. Or at least 0. Okay. So again, you have counter equals to 0. And then you're gonna run a for loop. So you're gonna run a for loop over element in transactions. So for x in transactions, all right? And then you check whether x is greater or equals to 0. If x is greater than or equals to 0, okay? So we're gonna for x in transactions, all right? You're gonna do run the if statement to check whether x is greater than or equal to 0. If it's greater than or equal to 0, then you need to add 1 to the counter. Okay. So this is for you to continue by yourself. Okay. And at the end, you will print counter. Okay. Which is the number of elements in transactions that is greater or equal to 0. Okay, so you follow this example here in sample code 3A. All right. Now, we're gonna compute the average amount of deposit made in 30 days. Average amount of deposit. So which is the same. So in other words, compute the sum of non-negative numbers in the list divided by the number of non-negative values in the list. So you need two values, the sum of all the non-negative numbers and the number of non-negative numbers in the list. So it's basically the same as what we have here. We'll require one result, which is the sum of all the non-negative numbers, and require a counter, which will count the number of non-negative numbers in the list. Okay, and then your average will be equal to result divided by counter, and you print the average. So this is for you to do as well. So again, you set result equals to 0, counter equals to 0, and the rest is for you to do. And at the end, you're gonna have average is equals to result divided by counter, and then you're gonna print the average amount of deposit in 30 days is okay. So this, you're gonna run a for loop, you're gonna do an if statement, and you're gonna add value to result and add value to counter. Now, let's go to subsequent examples. You're asked to create a program to ask user for 10 numbers and display the sum of these numbers. All right, so if you want to ask user for 10 numbers and display the sum of these 10 numbers, we're gonna do this by iterating the same block of code. So you already know how to ask user for a number, okay? So early on, you have seen, for example, ask user for one value, value 1 is equals to ask user for input, enter a number. All right, and then value 2, ask user for input, enter another number. All right, then and value 3 and so on and so forth. And then the result will be equals to value 1 plus value 2 value 3 and all the way. You have other value 3 as well. Again, the same thing, enter a number. All right, and then so on and so forth. And then result will be this, the sum of all these values. Okay, this is what you have learned in, I think, in the first or second lab. Okay, but that would require you to write 10 input statements and store each user input into a variable. So we have value 1, 2, 3, all the way to value 10. And then you need to write 10 of these values added up together and store into the variable called result. Now, again, there's a lot of repetition here. This is repeated 10 times. And this plus here also repeated. You're gonna value 1 plus value 2 plus value 3. And when you have something that is repetitions, you know that you're gonna need to one way you can automate this repetition is to write it using for loop it without explicitly write these 10 statements of asking user for input explicitly. So instead of doing so, we're gonna create a for loop and just write and repeat that once. Okay, so we're gonna repeat it 10 times. So for I in range 10, all right? Range 10 will generate integers from 0, 1, 2, 3, all the way to 9. So when you count from 0 all the way to 9, it's 10. It's 10 values. 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. There are 10 elements. So which means you iterate 10 times. Okay? So you repeat something 10 times. What is it that you want to repeat? You repeat asking user for input. Okay. Enter a number. Right? Now, so I'm gonna write here. So instead of writing 10 input statements to ask user for input and writing 10 additions, 10 addition expressions to get the sum of all these values. We will use for loop to repeat these operations. Okay. We're gonna run for loop over the range of 10. This will repeat things 10 times. At each iteration, we first ask user for input. All right. And then you already know how to add value to a sum, how to accumulate value. So for that, we will initialize the result equals to 0. Okay. And every single time in your iterations, once you get the value from the user input, you are going to add it into result. So you're gonna add value, which is the user input, into result. All right. So essentially, you repeat these statements 10 times, where you ask user 10 times for input, and every time after the user enter the input value, it will add the value into result. All right, so there will be an error, and I want you to check out and what is the error first before I rectify. So for example, I have an error immediately. It say that type error, unsupported operand type plus equal int and string. You have seen this error multiple times. Okay, we basically say that plus equal are the operations, but it does not support plus equal between int and string. Now that's immediately would tell you that okay, which means value is of type string, which is definitely of type string here because input is always of type string. So you can't add a string into an int, which is a type of result here. Okay, so you need to do typecast. Okay, so we're gonna make assumptions, assume that user inputs integer always. All right, in that case, we can immediately do typecast after user entered the input. So when the user entered the input, it will be a string, and then you typecast it into int and store it into the variable called value. So let's run it now. Say 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Some other values if you want to. 9, 10. I enter 10 values and the sum is 55. Okay. Good. So this is a solution of of how you can use for loop to repeat something instead of writing down this 10th input of expressions here. Okay? Right. Now it's your turn. You're asked to create a program. Here first, you are asked to create a program to for 10 number and display the product of these 10 numbers. All right, instead of sum now, you are going to use product. You're going to multiply them. Okay, so now let's look at here. All right, so now instead of adding to the value, you're going to do a multiplication. So you ask user for input value 1, value 2, value 3, and then you're going to multiply them. Okay, so let's do this part here. Okay, so you have 1, 2, 3, and so on, and you should continue with until value 10, and then instead of plus, you should have multiplication, and you should continue with the others value as well. I just give you an example of using just 3 values. Okay. All right, here, again, I need to do typecast here, int. Right, so I will assume user inputs integers always. Okay, just like before, I also assume user inputs integers. All right, so let's run the example, say 1, 2, 3. And of course, I should print result at the end. So again, 1, 2, 3, I get the value, which is 6. All right, so now, suppose I just do 3. We're going to change it to 10 later on. All right, so I'm going to have result equals to 0 for I in range 3. I'm going to ask user for an input. I typecast it into int. And then instead of plus now, previously this is plus, so I have plus equals. Now I'm going to do multiplication because I want to take the product of these integers. So I do multiplication. So instead of plus equal, now I do times equal value. And now if I print the result using the same input, 1, 2, 3, I get 0 instead of 6. All right, something is wrong here. We enter 1, we enter 2, and we enter 3. The product of these numbers should be 6 and not 0. And this is now you need to think what could be an issue here. So the issue here is because of here. Result is equal to initialize to 0. So when user enter 1 here in the first iteration, we have result times equals to 1. All right. So result is equal to 0. So result times equals to 1 is result is equal to result times value. Okay. So result is initialized to 0. So 0 times 1 is 0. Okay. So result always stays at 0 because no matter what value that you multiply to 0 will always stay at 0. And hence your results at the final value is still 0. So we cannot initialize result to be equal to 0 if you want to multiply all these numbers. So what should be the value of result instead? Okay, so the above code is incorrect because result is initialized to 0 in each iteration. All right, result is multiplied by value, okay, which computed to be 0 because 0 times anything is 0. So at the end, result will stay at 0. Okay, so to fix this, all right, you need to change the value of result. All right, you need to change the initialized value of results. So we need to change the initialized value of result. Okay, so what should we initialize result to? So we need the initial value of result to be such that in the first iteration, result times value is equal to value. Whatever value is, okay, in the first iteration, whatever value is, result times value should be equal to value. So what should be the value of result? It can't be 0 because 0 times value is not equal to value. 0 times value is 0. Okay, for whatever value is, you need the value of result so that result times value is equals to value. All right. So earlier on, when you do summation, when you do sum of the numbers, right? For example, in this case here, for our first sum value, say here, we can initialize equals 0 because 0 at the first iteration, 0 plus x is equals to x. Okay, because 0 plus anything will not add anything to it, so 0 plus x is equals to x in the iteration. Here, for product, the same thing, we want whatever value result initialize it should be such that when it times the first value of the first iteration should stay as the value of the first iteration. So what should be the value of result? So this is something that you need to figure it out and complete this. Okay, so this is for you to do, to fix. Okay, what should be the value of result? So this is to do. All right, and instead of 3 now, it's going to be 10 iterations. All right. So I'm going to put a remark here. Result is, this is wrong. The following code is wrong. This morning, following code is wrong. All right. So this is for you to complete. So everything will be right as long as your first initialized value of result is right. So what should it be? We know it can't be 0. What is the other value that we should put here? Okay. Now let's look at here. So here we fix a number. Say we want to add 10 numbers. Okay. Ask user for 10 number and display the sum of these numbers. Now we're gonna be more flexible. We're gonna ask user for the number that he wants to add. All right, it can be 10, it can be 3, it can be anything. And then we ask user for these n numbers and display the sum of these numbers. Okay, so basically it's the same as what we have. All right, instead of 10, it should be n. All right, but what is this n here? So we need to initialize or declare what is n. Okay, so n here is user input, which is input, enter the number of integers that you want to add. All right, and again, we all make assumptions. Assume that user always input integers. Okay, in that case, I can do typecast. When user always enter integers, I can do a typecast immediately. So n now will store the value of user input, which represent the number of integers that the user want to add. And then we have our usual code of adding these n elements. But first we ask user for these n elements, and every single time the user enter an element, we add it into a result. So ultimately we add these n elements and store it as a result. So here's an example. So say I would just want to add 3 numbers. Okay, so enter a number, say 1, enter another number, say 2, enter another number, say 3, and you say that the number is 6. So we can print meaningful messages. For example, the total, the sum of all the integers you entered is, say, result. So we can run this again. 1, 2, 3. All right. So notice here that this for loop here, the number of iterations in this for loop depends on the value of n and depends on the user input. So if I say I want to add just 2 numbers, all right, so I will have 2 iterations in my for loop, 1 and 2. So the sum of all the integers that I have entered is 1 plus 2, which is 3. Okay, so we create a flexibility for the user to enter how many integers that he wants to add. Now the same thing as an exercise. So you're going to ask the user to create to input an integer and store the value as n, ask the user for n numbers and display the product of these n numbers. So again, this will be something for you to do on your own. So it will be the same as before. So it will be the same as here. All right. Now, instead of plus equal, it should be times equal. And instead of result equals to 0, it should be initialized to something that is not 0. Okay. And it should be initialized to a value so that this value here times the first value of the first value input by the user equals. So for example, if user enter the first value is 2, result times 2 should be equals to 2. So what is this value here? Okay, so this is for you to do. All right, and that's the end. So here's a remarks. So ultimately, we create sort of a calculator that can do additions, that can do multiplications. And we kind of extend this calculator so that the users has the flexibility of deciding how many integers that he wants to add, how many integers that he wants to multiply. Okay, so it can be 2, it can be 3, it can be 10, it can be 100, and so on. But we want to extend this calculator so that the user can continue to add or continue to multiply until a certain instruction is given. All right, for example, suppose the user doesn't know that how many integers that he wants to add. So he wants to add, he doesn't know how many integers that he wants to add. So he will just keep adding until he has no number to add anymore. So can we do that? Now for for loop, unfortunately, you need to know how many iterations. All right. So this for loop here has to be written in such a way that you know how many iterations. All right. So it could be n, depends on user input. But if you don't know this number of iterations, if it depends on users command, say that I will keep adding until there is no next number to add. This is something that's we can't do this using for loop. So for for loop, for loop has a limitation. When you write a for loop, you need to know the number of iterations that you want to run. Okay, the number of iterations has to be finite. All right. So the following example, the following scenario can't be implemented using for loop, for example. So what scenario is that? So for example, create a program to add to ask user for input and input of numbers, input of number. Okay. Add the number into result, which is initialized to 0. All right. Repeat this until user enter not a number. Enter, for example, quit. Okay. So we want to create a program that keep asking user for a number. Every time the user enter a number, you add it into result. Result was initialized to 0. And you keep asking the user for input. And the user can say, I don't want to enter a number anymore. I will just put a command, say quit, and then it will stop. Okay. In this case, at the moment I write the program, I don't know when the user will hit quit. All right. I can't decide at the moment when I write the program how many iterations it will be, because it depends on the user input when it will hit, when it will enter quit. In that case, I don't know the number of iterations that I need to when I write this program. It's when the user enter quit, then I know that it will stop. But as long as user keep on adding numbers, keep on input the numbers, I don't know when it's gonna be stopped. So at this moment, when I want to run my for loop, I don't know how many iterations I need to run. So I can't use for loop. Okay, so we need a different way to write iterations for which it will allow us to write iterations for it will allow us to not having to specify the number of iterations when we write the program. So we need a different way to write iterations where we don't have, when we write it, we don't have to specify the number of iterations. So we will learn it in our next topic. We learn how to do so using while loop. It's again the iteration, but it allows us that to write the iterations where we don't have to specify the number of iterations that we needed when we write the program. Okay. And notice the difference between this scenario here and this program here that we asked you to write. So when I write this code, all right, when I run this for loop here, I know exactly how many iterations, n, because n is given by user input. So value of n is given after user put the input. So before you run line tree, execute this for loop here, the value of n is already defined. Value of n is already defined. So when you run line tree, you know the value of n, or basically the compiler, the interpreter, the Python interpreter knows the value of n. So he knows how many iterations it needs to run. Okay. So when the time you write the code, when you execute line tree, you know the value of n, you know the number of iterations. So you can use for loop. However, in this scenario here, we already need to ask user for input. and then add this value to result. And then we keep repeating it. We don't know how many iterations it's going to be because it only stop when the user enter quit, right? So we don't know how many iterations needed. So we can't use for loop. And in this case, we need to use while loop, which we will study next. All right, that's all for today. Thank you.